We're starting a new series today, and I want to start. I've just, it kind of hit me this week that I'm getting older faster. Like time is going by really quick. And this week I went to a assembly at Ferris, and all of a sudden, like it dawned on me, like I have 2 high school daughters, and one of them's a junior. So obviously, you know how quickly I pick up things. Like all of a sudden, I was like, man, I'm like a guy with 2 kids in high school, and like my life's really changing, and I'm starting to realize how fast time goes by. In fact, not just are they in high school, but 2 of my daughters are now driving, and one of them has been independently for a while. The other one is dangerously close. And when I use the word dangerously, I mean it, like dangerously close to driving on her own. And I'm a little bit nervous every time I'm in the car with her, but she'll figure this whole thing out. But this whole like kids driving thing, how many of you, like you're down this road, you're in front of me on this journey? Okay, yeah, a good number of you. That's good. That's good. So like last year, my oldest daughter, it was time to like find a car. We just decided we probably need a 3rd car. And I had really 2 things that I was thinking through in my mind. I thought, first of all, we need a car that already has lots of dents in it, because I don't want to worry about it getting wrecked. And I want it to be like big enough and maybe have like 4-wheel drive so she doesn't get wrecked, right? Those are like the 2 requirements for me. Like a car that I don't care if it gets wrecked, and a car that won't get her wrecked, right? So that was the combination. So that kind of narrowed, things like the price range, everything. It kind of gives you lots of choices. So we go on Craigslist. We found this car. This guy says, meet me in the Target parking lot in the valley. And we go out there and we show up, and the car is like the exact color that she wants. Like it is this green kind of strange color that actually led to her naming the car Starbucks, which is her favorite place. So the car's name is Starbucks. So she sees the car immediately. She's like, oh, Dad, I like the color, which with girls, that's all that really matters, right? Me, I look at it, and this is my first thought. This car, it's a Nissan Pathfinder, and I'm like, man, when it was like an old one, like when I was in college, and I look at it and I think, man, when I was in college, I wanted one of these, right? Like, guys, you know what that's like, right? Like you had a buddy who had like a Nissan Pathfinder or a Toyota 4Runner, and his parents spoiled him or whatever. And you were like, man, I wish I could have one of those instead of my like 1977 Honda Civic or whatever you were driving, like me, right? And so like, I remember when these came out, and I was just, man, I would have loved to have had one. So I see it and I'm just stoked, because I'm like, yeah, Pathfinder, that's a cool, like, that would have been cool for me to drive that when I was in high school. And so she liked the color, and I was like kind of like reminiscing to my past. And so we like shot to the house, got some cash, met the guy, and we bought it and took it home. And I got it home and immediately pulled it in the garage, and I started like detailing it, because I was like, I really want my girl to be like in a clean car. I want everything to be good. So I started detailing, scrubbing stuff. And with every layer of dirt that I removed, the more problems I found that I didn't discover in my inspection in the Target parking lot. And like about 15 minutes into this thing, I'm like, that guy lied to me. Like I asked him good questions, and he like, who lies to you about a car? Like, right? Everybody does apparently. But anyway, so I'm like going through, and I'm like finding stuff, and just like these rust holes I could put my head through. I mean, there's like stuff I really missed. Like you pull back the carpet and you're like, what is this? And like, I'm surprised there wasn't a dead animal in the thing. It was really bad, like really bad. And so like I'm going through it, and I'm like, well, you know what? I think it's going to be fine. So kind of shut the garage up that night, go in the house, wake up in the morning, and I open the door to the garage. And when I do, there's this smell of gas fumes that just rushes in and fills our house. And I'm like, now what? And so I go out there, and sure enough, the fuel tank leaks on this thing. So I tried to take the shield off to work on that, busted all the bolts, which my mechanic loved when I dropped it off to him later, and he had no way to get the shield off the gas tank. So I left it at my mechanic, and he had it for a month. An entire month, not because he liked it. Let me just mention that. Not because he was out driving it, right? So finally get the thing back. And by the time we got it back, it's like, well, now winter's here. We needed new tires. It needed new brakes. And so I do that stuff. And so we've just been like limping this car along. And in fact, it's gotten to the point these days where she's like, Dad, if I drive longer than 10 or 15 minutes, I have to pull over and let it rest. Which, from a mechanical standpoint, I don't know what that means, but I'm okay with it. Like, I'm just like, all right, then let it rest, So she pulls over and she lets it rest. And here's the problem. Every time she calls me and she's away from the house, I'm afraid it's not going to wake up from its nap, right? Like, Dad, I let it rest and it didn't come back. Like, this was it. This is the end. And so we've been driving this, she's been driving this thing, and A couple weeks ago, I was like, well, I need to go check all the fluids and just make sure it's not going to blow up while she's driving it. So I went out and I'm checking all the fluids and, just kind of like reminiscing about how cool this car once was. And then I drove it. I just took it off. I was like, man, I'm going to drive and see if I have to make it rest. And sure enough, as the dad, nothing ever goes wrong when you're driving. I'm like, it's fine. So I get back to the house. It was early in the morning and I was standing outside and it's on the side of our house and I was looking at it. And I was like, man, how did something that was so cool, like just not that long ago, how did something that like I would have loved to have had this? In fact, Nathan came this last week to me and he's like, dude, Morgan's got the best car and she's got the best high school car. And I was like, you want it? But you can have it. In fact, any of you, we keep the keys under the seat and I'll give you my address. You can have it if you want because I just wait for the thing to disappear. But I'm standing out there and I'm looking at it. I'm like, man, how is it possible that this car that was so cool and so amazing now is this vehicle that is obsolete, it's dated, it's worn out. Like now it's a car that's a burden to me and I don't even want it. And so I'm standing there, I'm thinking about this and I'm looking at it. And all of a sudden in this moment, I start thinking about conversations that I've been having over the past year or year and a half with different people about faith. And what I started to realize was that for a lot of people in my life, I think they're wrestling with their faith. They're wrestling with this whole Christianity thing, this church thing, this Jesus thing, in the same way that I'm wrestling with whether or not we should keep this car. Like Jesus somehow is growing somewhat obsolete. Like the church, like this faith system that we're operating in is somehow becoming outpaced by the world that we live in. I have conversations with people, and these are very real dialogues. I've got a friend that is really struggling to stay faithful to the faith of his youth because as he's growing older, the exposure that he has to people from different cultures and from different faith backgrounds and different opinions and ethical systems, the more he gets exposed to those individuals and those conversations, the more he begins to wonder, like, these are really good people. In fact, he is shocked to realize how much he likes people who don't believe like he believes. And so he's wrestling, saying, how do I reconcile what I believe with the differences that we have? And so there's this crisis of faith. I know other people, maybe this is you, where you've had an experience like where you sat through a lecture or you watch a video of some sort, or you read a book and it presents ideas, and those ideas are groundbreaking, they're new, they're wonderful, but when you take them back and try to align them with things you know in the Bible or things that you understand to be true from the life of Jesus, all of a sudden connecting those dots becomes really complicated, and so the crisis starts to rise up, and you start to figure out, like, am I able to actually reconcile my faith with the things that I know to be true, either scientifically or intellectually? And so there's a tension that can rise up inside of us, right? Or this is also happening. This is very common that in society, as culture shifts and changes, the common conversations, the cultural dialogue that exists today is maybe so different from the cultural ethic of the Bible that we begin to question because the pressures of cultural conversation seem to be contradicting. And so we say, what do I do with the apparent contradictions in the predominant culture around me and what the Bible's saying for me to do? And so the faith crisis starts to increase. I have some friends that I have friends that have just abandoned it altogether and have just said, you know what, this is way too complicated. Like, the Bible isn't trustworthy. In fact, this summer I was with a friend and we were camping, and this one night we were just staring up at the stars, and out of the blue he says, you know, the expansiveness of the universe, just the sheer size of the universe, and all that's unexplained is one of the reasons I cannot find the Bible to be believable, because there is no construct in the Bible for the unimaginable things that are out there. Like the historicity of the Bible, the geology of the Bible, just, it doesn't have enough in it to make this even possible. And so the question for me that's coming out of these conversations, the question that just keeps rising up inside of me is this issue of whether or not God has somehow become irrelevant to us. Like, can God keep up with the world today? Has somehow this message of Jesus and the church and faith that has somehow been relevant and applicable through thousands of years of generations, have we finally reached a point where now we just know enough? Like, we know enough, and we have enough difference of experience around us. There's enough information now in our understanding that now we've reached this point where we go, you know what, I'm not sure Jesus is really relevant anymore because of what we now know. Like, is that the situation? Is it possible that this whole faith and Jesus and church thing is like my daughter's Pathfinder? Sitting on the side and we're like, man, reminiscing, but also realizing it's growing obsolete and getting worn, getting tired. Here's what I think is fascinating. As much as I have those conversations, those same individuals, oftentimes in the same breath, will begin to talk about someone or something that is out there beyond them. So while they're wrestling with the language, with the systems, with maybe the faith of their youth, there is still this acknowledgement, this deep sense that there is someone or something else. There is this truth that resonates inside of them, that you and I are more than just the sum of our parts, that we are more than just this gathering of molecules and cells, that there is something about us that is special, and there is something about this world that is unique, and there is someone or something that is out there. But the language, the system for understanding, something seems to be off, which brings us back to the question, is Jesus somehow becoming obsolete? Or could it be? Could it be that the problem isn't with Jesus? Could it be that the faith and the God and the system that people are rejecting, the church that people have a problem with, could it be that really isn't the Jesus, the church, the faith that was supposed to be presented in the first place? I mean, is it possible? Is there a way that maybe you or maybe my friends or maybe the family members that you have that are wrestling with these sorts of things, is it possible that the very issues we're wrestling with are things that aren't even on the radar of Jesus, that these are things that weren't even to be considered or wrestled with because they're so different from what he was trying to get us to understand? Could it be, and this is a real possibility, could it be that there is a faith? Is it possible that there's a faith that educated, cultural, intellectual individuals could actually put their trust in? Is that possible? That's the question that we're presented with. And today we're beginning a series in the book of Matthew looking at the life and the words of Jesus. And here's why. I believe we need an awakening regarding who Jesus is and what he was really about. I believe we need a resurrection of our own faith. We need our own faith to come back to life. We need to test whether or not we have allowed religiosity to pollute our systems. If we'd allow the very things that Jesus came to confront to warp our understanding of faith, we need to have a revolution of our own faith systems. We need to rediscover the source of our own lives. We need to have our lives be reoriented around the God who is the ground, the source of our being. That has to happen. We have to discover whether or not there is more to this life than just punching the time clock and paying off the credit card bill. There has to be more, and we need to discover it. Because I don't believe that Jesus or the faith or the life that he presents to us has grown tired. I don't believe it's anything like my daughter's car. But I do believe that there are perspectives, and I think there are understandings about God that we have missed or we've forgotten, and those things need to be restored. I do believe there are depths and there are dimensions that we aren't diving into, and because we've settled for something less, now we're rejecting something that we never should have been faced with to begin with. This series is about us becoming more alive in Jesus and more aware of him. It's about understanding a God who is bigger and more expansive, who's actually doing something in the world that we're living in today. It's about us pulling off our glasses and cleaning them because they've been fogged and our view's been restricted, and putting them back on and being able to see Jesus for who he is. Today, I want to start talking about this. And I want to do it. I want to begin by talking about something very interesting, and you're going to wonder why we'll talk about this. But I want to start talking about this by talking about the greatest hamburger that you've ever had in your life. All right? I know some of you are like, okay, we just turned like a 90-degree corner. But let me explain this. When I was a kid, we went camping, and I grew up in Arizona, and we would go camping occasionally in southern Utah. And so we went up to southern Utah this one year, and I don't even know how old I was. And remember, we were camped for like a week or two. I don't know all the details. All I remember is pulling into this little town called Cush Harem. It's in this place called Grass Valley. It's a tiny little town, like 200 people. Pulled into this town, and we found a restaurant, went into the restaurant, and we ordered hamburgers. And we hadn't eaten out or anything like that in a really long time. When I was a kid, we didn't eat out as much then anyways. And so it was kind of a treat to eat out, especially camping. I'll never forget, the hamburgers delivered to the table, and we sit down, biting into that hamburger. Within the first bite, I immediately knew, like, this is the best hamburger that I've ever eaten. Like, the meat was seasoned perfectly, and the bread, it seemed like, it was from heaven, like manna. And I'm not kidding, I still remember liking the lettuce on the burger. Right? Like, how many times does that happen? You're like, this lettuce is so good. I love this, right? And I remember as a kid, like, this is amazing. And as a family, we talked about that hamburger for a really long time. Like, we were always like, man, the best hamburger we've ever had in our life was that one in Cush Harem, Utah. Then I had a crisis because I love hamburgers, all right? I love hamburgers, and suddenly I realized I'm never going to be there again. Like, that's a really difficult place to go for a hamburger if I want a good hamburger. And so as a kid, I had this crisis. Like, that was the gold standard, and I would never measure up to that again. But something happened. Years later, I went on a backpacking trip with some buddies. And after this backpacking trip, we stopped at a restaurant, and we ordered hamburgers. And guess what? It was the best hamburger that I'd ever eaten in my life. Like, goodbye Cush Harem hamburger. This is the new pinnacle of hamburgers, right? Like, it was amazing. I was like, this is an amazing piece of art in front of me. And so I dove into this hamburger. And then what I began to discover from that point forward is that hamburgers have this amazing ability to become incredibly good when you have been away from them for a very long time. Right? Because there's this other truth. This other truth is that this sense of complacency comes when we're overexposed to anything, right? We get numb to whatever anything is that we've been constantly exposed to. And so if you eat hamburgers every single day, it doesn't matter what hamburger it is or where you get it. Pretty soon the nuances of the wonder of a hamburger go away. At some point you realize this is just a piece of meat. It's not even ham. Talk about a sales pitch, right? It's just a piece of meat between two pieces of bread with some leftover salad on top, right? And if you eat hamburgers every day, pretty soon that's what they become. But you take a break, get some time away. I'll never forget Scott Martin and I coming off of Mount Adams a couple years ago. We come down, we stop at McDonald's. I hate McDonald's. We have a Big Mac. It was the best hamburger I've ever eaten in my life. I wound up eating like 20 of them over the next month. It was horrible, right? Because the best hamburger you have ever had is the one you haven't tasted for a while, because familiarity breeds complacency. And what I'm afraid of has happened with the story of Jesus is that we've become so familiar with some of the most beautiful details that we've become complacent to the beauty of the story and the revolutionary nature of what is being presented to us in the person of Christ. Like, we've just eaten too many hamburgers and we've lost the great sense of wonder regarding Jesus. And so I want us to begin today in a very odd and very unusual place. I want us to start not by looking at the parables or not by looking at the interactions between Jesus and his disciples or between Jesus and the religious leaders or between Jesus and those that were following in crowds. I want us to start by looking at the very earliest moments of his life. Some of the most familiar details to some of us, some of the most mundane to others of us, but some of the most powerful things that set the stage for who he is. If you have your Bible, I want you to open up to the book of Matthew, chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, the words will be on the screen. The book of Matthew is a gospel. I just want to mention that. Those of you that maybe haven't been around church a while or unfamiliar with the Bible, the book of Matthew is in the New Testament. The New Testament has 4 books that are called the Gospels. There's different genres of literature in the Bible. The Gospels are a very specific kind of genre of literature. It's a book that is actually written to tell the biography of Jesus, the meaning of his life, the purpose for him coming, and what that means for us. And there are 4 distinct biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those 4 biographies all have nuances that make them different. Now, what's interesting is that Matthew and Luke do something that neither Mark nor John do. And Matthew and Luke begin their stories with these things called genealogies. And genealogies are absolutely fascinating. For those of you who don't know what a genealogy is, especially as it relates to a Bible, a genealogy is the one part of the Bible that when you're reading it, you're allowed to completely skip. That's what the genealogy is. I'm kidding, kind of. But I know, like, for me, like, and like, this is kind of the truth. Like, some of you, like, hardcore people, like, I'm going to read the Bible in a year. You get to genealogies, and you read the genealogies like I played saxophone in like, grade school, right? You just fake it, right? You're like, oh, just kind of like, maybe if I hit a few words here and there, kind of hit a few notes, and then move on, everything's good, right? That's the way you read. You're like, Abinadab, whoever, whatever. Okay, now let's get to the meat. That was the fastest I've ever read, right? We do that because we think they're boring. But what's beautiful is that in genealogies, there is wonder. There's amazing things. And in fact, I told Sherry yesterday, I said, I feel like I could preach for 4 weeks on the genealogies of Jesus. And she looked at me and she goes, don't. Like, don't. And I was like, well, we've got this overcrowding issue at Summit. It would probably take care of it. Like, people wouldn't come back, right? But genealogies, they tell a story. Genealogies, they do more than just say, here are some people who lived. It tells a story of where people lived and how they related to each other. A genealogy connects an individual to history. It roots a person and tells us where they came from. And I want to start with this with Jesus because there are things in the genealogy of Jesus. And by the way, we're not even going to spend the whole morning. Some of you are relieved. You don't have to keep looking at your watch. We'll spend part of our time looking at the genealogy of Jesus. But I want to start there because even in the genealogy, even in the very first moments that most of us, because of our familiarity, have munched through this maybe hundreds of times and not paid attention, there are things that are beautiful and challenging and wonderful in these words. So I want to start with the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1. Verse 1, it says this, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. I love salmon, especially when it's grilled. And Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam, the father of Abijah, Abijah, the father of Asaph, Asaph, the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat, the father of Joram, and Joram. And you get the idea, right? We get to Uzziah, we get to Jotham, Jotham, Ahaz, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amos, Amos, Jonah, Josiah. Like, you go through this, you start figuring out why people skip this, right? It doesn't take very long. And so that's why I'm going to do that. I'm going to skip and skim through. And it ends with this verse 16 where it says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. And you wonder, why in the world did Matthew begin this story this way? This seems like a really boring way to start a really exciting book. I mean, this is like that aunt that shows up at the holidays and is always talking about relatives you don't know, right? Like, we don't care, and we're not visiting them on vacation, right? You wonder, why did he do this? There's a point to it. And one of the first and most important points that I think all of us need to understand is that Jesus is not a mythical being. You see the genealogy of Jesus, and immediately it confronts this notion that we have that somehow Jesus is mythological, that he's some sort of creature that occasionally appears in history. Suddenly we have Jesus who is rooted in time and in place. He has family and he has history. In fact, Matthew explicitly emphasizes the fact that Jesus descended from David and Abraham. And here's what's interesting about him including this detail. Matthew's gospel was actually written to be spread among people. So it would be moved around the region and people would read it. Sometimes they would read it by themselves. Sometimes it was actually read aloud to entire groups in one whole sitting. Thank God you didn't go to that church, right? So they would sit out and read this thing. So when they read this genealogy, when they were doing this, there were people in different regions who obviously were opposed to Christianity. They were opposed to Jesus. And in this genealogy, there is a direct claim made that says that Jesus descends from Abraham and David. That would have been incredibly offensive to the Jews. Here's what's fascinating. This document was circulated, it was well known, people read it everywhere, and there is zero historical evidence that says that anybody that was opposed to Jesus, any historian, any protector of the Jewish faith, anyone ever rose up and said, this genealogy is artificial. It was a commonly accepted reality that not only was Jesus real, but that Jesus descended from Abraham and David. This is a person who lived in time and space that nobody could deny, not even the most outlandish claims of his life. He is a real person from real people. That realization alone, I think, for some of us should just wake us up. Wake us up from a slumber that we've been caught in, kind of dealing numbly with Jesus. This is a very real person set in history. Not only that, but this makes other statements. The genealogy brings other things to the surface, and I want to point some of these things out. There are other messages that are sent. There are names, and I was starting to name some of them in his genealogy. Here's some examples of some of them. There was Judah that was mentioned. There was Ruth. There was David. There was Uzziah. There was Hezekiah. There was Josiah. Here's what's interesting. We look at those names and we go, some of you are like, oh, maybe we'll name our child that someday, right? Those sound interesting. Those names actually meant something to the people that were reading this. Again, when they got this document and it began with the genealogy of Jesus, and suddenly they read Judah and Ruth and David and Uzziah and Hezekiah and Josiah, these were not insignificant names in a genealogy. These were the heroes of the Hebrew faith. These are individuals who stood head and shoulders above everybody else. These were the rock stars of the day. These were the people that every Jewish boy and Jewish girl grew up knowing the story of their life. And Matthew has the audacity to include them in the genealogy of Jesus. He's simply saying there is a long line of heroes, and now there is on the scene another one. Everybody knew this was a heroes list, and Jesus is on it. Not just on it, but what's also interesting is that the way that Matthew presents this is very fascinating. Oftentimes, individuals reach to their genealogy for some sense of credibility. We do that in our culture today. You hear people say things like, well, I'm German. And we look at them like, oh, cool, that's really great, you're German. Or, I'm Italian. You're like, great, okay, that's great. And it's like, that gives me credibility because I'm Italian. And whatever that is. And sorry, I offended Germans and Italians in this service. I'll offend others in other services. But we do this. We reach to our genealogy to support something, right? Well, in this case, Matthew does it in a way where essentially what he's building towards and what we begin to see is that these individuals don't lend credibility to Jesus. Jesus is giving credibility and meaning to them. In other words, Jesus is the exclamation point to the stories of all of these individuals. What Matthew is saying is that these people's lives, they mattered and they linked together. And as they link together, they culminate in this person, Jesus, the hero of heroes. He is the highest on the list. And then there's even more. Embedded in this are other details. And again, I could go on, but there is one other detail I want to point out. Because in this one, we see the very heart of God towards humanity. Matthew's genealogy includes women. And for the Jews, a genealogy rarely, if ever, included the name of a woman. And Matthew, as they're reading these names, and just the way we read it in our culture, we go, oh yeah, there's just some people's names. In that culture, the moment that a woman's name was read, people's ears would have perked up. They would have paid attention and said, wait, did you just mention a woman's name? And then again, and then again, and then again? And outside of Mary, the mother of Jesus, there are 4 other women that are mentioned in this story. Now, that could be seen as a foreshadowing because Jesus obviously liberates women remarkably from the cultural constructs that existed previously. Like, Christ followers have done wonderful things to bring justice in the context of women and rights. Is that a foreshadowing to that, or is there more to it? It's interesting because when you look, there's actually other women that could have been named. In fact, there are other names that I'll just give you as examples. If Matthew was just trying to draw attention to women and what Jesus would accomplish with women in his lifetime or with his followers, he would have probably mentioned these names. He could have mentioned Sarah. He could have mentioned Rebecca, he could have mentioned Leah, and he could have mentioned Rachel. All of them were connected to the story. All of them, their names could have been read, and people would have gone, oh yeah, that's a woman, and a very respectable woman, and it would have raised that understanding. Instead, I want you to look at who he actually mentioned. These are the women that Matthew actually puts in the lineage of Jesus. Tamar of Canaan, Rahab of Jericho, Ruth of the Moabites, and the ex-wife of Uriah the Hittite. So why are these women being included? Because now we have an issue. The moment their names were said or read, they popped off the page, and it wasn't some woman that everybody just said, oh, she was a great Jewish leader in her time. It was a woman who actually wasn't Jewish. It was a woman who came from a Gentile population. They were an outsider. Not only were they outsiders, but each of these women had a story. You know what I mean by a story? Like they had a story to tell. So when genealogies are used to bring some sort of credibility or to prove the purity of a person's lineage, Matthew intentionally pollutes the lineage of Jesus with the story of outside Gentile dogs who were caught up in the history of Jesus. And not only that, they're women with stories. We see just even in the mention of their names, in the very beginning pages of the book of Matthew, we have it being presented to us that this Jesus who we are about to talk about is going to upset the cultural norms around him. This Jesus is going to turn upside down the religious exclusivity that exists in the culture, the habits of individuals in elite positions to push others away because they don't look right, talk right, or smell right. This is a Jesus who's going to include others like nobody has before. He is real. He is the hero of heroes, and he is going to do some things that are unexpected and earth-shattering. In the next few verses, you get out of the genealogy, and in verse 18, some of the controversy just continues. The birth of Jesus is, again, one of those familiar places that we can grow complacent to. But listen to this. Verse 18 says, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, 'Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She'll bear a son, and you'll call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet," and this is Isaiah 7, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." And Matthew takes the effort to describe to us what that means. God with us. This is the birth story of Jesus. Birth stories matter. I remember when my kids were younger, and maybe you had this, like kids love hearing their story of their birth, right? Like when they're a certain age, hey, tell me about this. Some of you remember your kids like, hey, tell me about, you'd like tell them a story. Or maybe it was just like at night before they go to bed, you would just describe to them what it was like when they were born, the day you brought them home. And it's like this very endearing thing. This is the birth story of Jesus. But this one is different. This one has a couple of key components. First, there's this controversy with Mary and Joseph. This is pretty controversial. Like, this is a birth story where Jesus says, "Hey guys, tell me about the day you brought me home," or like the day, tell me my story. Give this to me. And Joseph's like, "Well, so your mom got pregnant. It wasn't me." really awkward, right? So then we had this conversation. I wasn't sure what to do, right? So I kind of dive into this thing. And so the story of Jesus, like the birth story of Jesus and his origin, it isn't this nice, neat, clean story. It's the story that is immediately filled with controversy and, in fact, the story of redemption. If you look at this, Joseph is living in a culture where while people have begun to treat each other more justly in regard to marriage, it was a very common understanding that in this situation, Mary could just be banished. Like Joseph had every right legally, every right morally to just say, Mary, I'm done with you. And in the very birth story of Jesus, what we have is God intervening in a very broken, controversial situation and bringing redemption and life to this story. Do you think it's foreshadowing possibly to his future? It's this beautiful example of God of second chances coming into the scene. It's amazing. Not only that, but the other characteristic is this amazing miracle, this thing that we call the virgin birth. You know, important biblical characters, when you look back in the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, oftentimes their arrival is accompanied by some sort of miraculous birth. If you look at Moses, the circumstances around his birth and his survival, incredibly miraculous, right? If you look at the story of Samuel, you look at the story of Samson, look at the story of John the Baptist, over and over again we see these very significant people who have some sort of impact on the history of faith and life and humanity. They have these miraculous birth stories. And then we have this story. We have this miracle baby of Jesus right in line. So as individuals then, just like today, are reading this, it's like this guy has to be special because his story looks like one of those rare stories where God chose somebody even when they were in the womb. Like, this is amazing. But then this miracle birth makes a declaration unlike any other. Verse 23, he says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. In other words, this miracle child is different. So yes, this individual descended from David and Abraham and all of these individuals, this hero, this very real person who's rooted and connected to history is going to be here, but this person is also unique in a way that no one has ever seen. He is literally God with us. Matthew quotes something that all of his readers would have known, like this was an announcement that was being made. His name, Emmanuel, God with us. God in our midst. He's saying this person now on the scene is God before us and with us. Maybe we've just grown too familiar with this. But do you realize the significance? We cannot grow numb to what's being stated here. This, Jesus, who he is, and the circumstances surrounding his birth, they reveal the very nature and the heart of God. Not only that, Matthew continues, and I'll just summarize this. Matthew continues, and so do the very surprising details in the first few moments of Jesus' life. In chapter 2, you turn over to chapter 2 of Matthew, you see the story of the Magi. The Magi, or the wise men, we always joke, we always have 3 of them at home in the manger scene. We actually don't know how many there were, but we know there were wise men, there were Magi, there were Persians, which essentially means that these guys were astrologers. Astrologers, it basically means that these guys woke up every morning and they opened, like the New York Times, and they went to the horoscope page and they were like, Cancer, okay, what's my day going to look like today? That's what these guys did. They looked at the stars for signs. And by the way, Cancer, what a horrible sign. Like, son, you're a Cancer. That's a horrible thing to be named with. But anyways. But these individuals, these Magi, they're stargazers, they're outsiders, they're people who tried to find their way to God through means other than the Hebrew faith, and they were generally rejected by the Jews. And what we have in chapter 2 is the very first individuals arriving to worship Jesus and to be welcomed by Jesus are actually outsiders who were the last people that anyone ever imagined. In fact, those outsiders come to Herod, who's the king of the Jews, and they say, we hear this guy's been born, we want to go worship him. And Herod's response to that is, I'd like to kill him. which is incredibly surprising, right? The very people we expect to not like Jesus, and the very people we expect to be excited about Jesus are not excited about Jesus. In fact, in that moment, Herod does something unbelievable. This is the craziest story, and this is one of those details. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but Herod calls the religious leaders to himself when he hears this, and he's like, guys, I hear the Messiah has been born. Somebody tell me where this kid is, because he wants to go get him. Somebody give me the information, like, where is he born? So listen to this. This is verses 4 and 5 of Matthew 2. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. Here's what's crazy. Two things that are crazy. They knew the answer. Like, these guys come and they're like, hey, we saw this star. We heard this guy's being born. Herod's like, guys, give me the details. Like, oh, yeah, Bethlehem. Like, everybody knows that. That's insane. They actually knew the answer. What's even more insane is they did nothing with it. Like, the religious elite, the biblical scholars, the ones who protected the faith, they sat on their hands and they did nothing with probably the most significant piece of information in history. They didn't even go there. They were so numb, they were so dead to the reality of who Jesus is that they're completely overlooked. And it makes me wonder, had God become obsolete, or had they just simply become complacent? Was this story of a Messiah just worn out? Or had they just moved on? So the Magi, they come and they worship. And Herod is jealous. And then Matthew includes this detail that you've probably overlooked, and I'll be brief with this. He includes this detail of Joseph taking Mary and his newborn son off to Egypt. And we kind of read that and go, well, that's interesting that, like, they fled to Egypt and Jesus would later return to Galilee. And like, that's an interesting biographical detail. But what's fascinating is the symbolism, because Egypt was the place that every Jewish boy and girl had learned about his people exiting from in the Exodus. Egypt was the place where they had been in slavery and in bondage, and they were delivered out of Egypt and escaped the wrath of a Pharaoh. And now in the birth of Jesus, if you want to talk about subversive, we have Jesus going to Egypt to avoid the wrath of a Jewish king who looks an awful lot like the Pharaoh. And we have Jesus forming around him a new exodus of people, a new group of people who are leaving an old kind of life behind. See, all of these details, all of these things, they bring us to this place where we have to say, what is Matthew trying to tell us in the story of Jesus? And it's really clear. This is subversive. This is unexpected. This is radical. This is describing groups who are being included, who had never been included before. That this is giving a picture of a God who is not distant or detached. This is giving a picture of a God who is not indifferent to our pain, a God who actually knows pain and knows suffering, a God who is actually in exile and lived as an exile in Egypt, a refugee. This is a God who is not uninterested in the human condition, who actually cares about the place that we live and the struggles that we have and the things that we live with every single day. This is a God who cares about that. This is a God who is involved with the very real, tangible pains and joys of every single day of life. This is a God who is present. This is a God, and I want you to catch this, this is a God who is with us and a God who is for us. That's what's being told to us. For every one of us that have a messed up past and a crazy genealogy, the story of Jesus says, I like you. For people who are distant and didn't know if God would ever come near or be approachable to them, he says, I'm with you. I'm for you. I want you to wrestle with this question just for a second. Do you believe that God is for you? When you wake up in the morning, this God that you believe in, do you believe, do you wake up in the morning with this sense of, man, God is on my side, God's got my back? Is that how you live your life? You jump in your car in the morning, no matter the speed bumps you hit, no matter the hiccups that you face in life, is there this sense inside of you? Do you live your life with this very real sense that God actually loves you, that he wants your life to flourish, that he wants your life to be full of peace and joy and wonder? And do you believe that? Do you believe that the God that we're reading about is a God who is for you and a God who is with you, that every day you go out, he's right there saying, I got you? Do you believe that? I think somehow we have buried this fundamental Christian truth underneath piles and piles of againsts and condemnation. I believe that underneath piles of sermons where people have preached and told you that God isn't happy with you unless you, and then fill in the blank, or if you do this, God will do this for you. I think piled under those kinds of sermons is this fundamental truth, this reality where God is saying, I am for you and I'm with you. I think under piles of bullhorns and sandwich board signs of people condemning other individuals, there is this sense, this hope that there is a God who is for us. I think that when we get past the wars and the crusades and the evil done in the name of religion, somewhere at the heart of this is this understanding that God is for humanity. He's not against humanity. God is for you. He loves you and he's with you. And that's what this story is all about. I think it's time we reclaimed this and we liberated the story of Jesus. And we clarified it for ourselves and for our own minds and for our friends who are wrestling with their faith and our children and our family members who are trying to decide whether or not this Jesus has grown obsolete or whether or not he can still make a difference today. We need this sort of revolution. The people of Israel, the Hebrews, historically, they had such a beautiful understanding of the nearness and the presence of God. They used this term ruach, which is one of my favorite Hebrew words that described God as the breath, the wind that animated life. And the ancient Hebrews grasped this. But when Jesus came, culture, political power, materialism had choked out this understanding and something had to give. And in our culture, with materialism and power and all of the things that strive to distract us from meaning, something has to give, and we have to return to seeing how beautiful and wonderful Jesus is. We have to understand that this is a God who is with us and who is for us. I want to end where we began this morning. I think sometimes we need to see that this is not a message that I came up with, or that maybe somebody did a few years ago. I think sometimes we need to understand that this is a message that God has been trying to communicate with us from the very beginning, and there's a reason it resonates so deeply inside of us. But I want to finish with Psalm 18, verses 16 to 19. But I want you to hear it through the lens of this God who is with us and this God that is for us. This is what David said, and I want you to imagine yourself in this situation, because these are words that apply to any one of us. Verse 16, it says, He sent from on high, and He took me, and He drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity. But the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad meadow. He rescued me because He delighted in me. You have a God that is for you and a God that is with you. Would you pray with me? I think if those words sink deeply into our hearts. They have the power to radically transform the way the rest of this day, the rest of this week, whatever it looks. So I'm just going to invite you to pause right now and just take a moment and let God's forness, let God's withness, let God's delight just sink deeply into your soul.